Wilson is a professional. Oh, thank you. Dawn Wilson is a professional and award-winning nature photographer, specializing in images and stories about wildlife of high latitudes and high altitudes of the Rocky Mountains in Alaska. Dawn's text and photography has appeared in numerous regional and national publications, including Colorado Life, Colorado Outdoors, Wyoming Wildlife, Outdoor Photographer, Motor Home Magazine, Nature's Best Photography, and many others. In addition to her editorial work, Dawn leads multiple workshops each year to photograph wildlife, such as brown bears in Alaska and birds in Louisiana. She also leads photo tours in Rocky Mountain National Park. She currently serves as president of the North American Nature Photography Association, AKA NANPA. And Dawn, I don't have your website on here. It's just Dawn Wilson.
DawnWilsonPhotography.com.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Dawn, take it away.
I'll put that in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, can you guys see that okay? Did that pop up?
Yes, it looks good.
Perfect. Yep. All right, so we're going to jump right into it since Ellen did a phenomenal job on the intro. Like I mentioned, I did take out my background slide. So this is what you see when you first land in Churchill. So this is the kind of one of the welcome signs out by the airport, but this is basically what that habitat looks like. It is a tundra area. Most of the plants there are willows, kind of like a scrubby willow. And then the forest that's not too far away is a spruce forest. So if you're not familiar with where Churchill is, it's actually this red dot on the southwest side of Hudson Bay. So Hudson Bay, and there's actually a river that comes out. I'll talk about that. I think that's in the next slide. There's only about 800 people that live in the town, and there's about 1,000 polar bears. So there's actually more polar bears than people in this region. So one of the things I was mentioning earlier was that, Churchill has never felt, it doesn't seem like it's that far away, because actually Alaska is even farther north than Churchill, but it is remote. I mean, there's not too much up there. Once you get past Winnipeg, which is down farther in Manitoba, or actually Winnipeg's over in Alberta, but most of the people live in the southern part of Manitoba, and this is all just a lot of prairie pothole type habitat, very flat. So there's not really much up there. This is a closer up look of that southwest corner of Hudson Bay. You can see this waterway that comes into Churchill. It's called the Churchill River, and that's actually the reason why polar bears kind of congregate around this area. The winds, the prevailing winds kind of push down from the north. And what winds up happening is that this is fresh water coming out of the river. Hudson Bay is salt water. So what winds up happening is that the winds push all of the waves into that fresh water, and the fresh water freezes before salt water. So this area on this little peninsula here, this little point near the Churchill River, actually freezes before anything else in Hudson Bay. So one of the reasons that the polar bears are around that area in late October, early November is that they're waiting for the water of Hudson Bay to freeze. And once it freezes, they head out onto the ice for the winter to go out and hunt for seals, which is their main food source. And that's how they build up all of their fat reserves to survive throughout the year. So this is what downtown Churchill looks like. It's not the fanciest place in the world. There is only one main paved road in town, and there are no roads that lead into Churchill. So you cannot drive to Churchill. You have to arrive by either train or plane. The train does not operate all the time. I think it was 2017, there was actually a really bad storm that caused a lot of frost heaves and buckled the tracks, and it actually took them a couple of years to fix that. So everything had to come in and out via the plane. So, and during the polar bear season, there's actually an advised curfew from 10 p.m. to daylight. This photograph was taken about 11 p.m. outside of our hotel. This is the main road. This is the only paved road in town. But I wanted to give an idea of what that downtown area looks like. It's quiet. They do have because of the curfew from 10 to daylight, they actually have a siren that goes off at 10 o'clock at night. it sounds very much like a tornado warning siren. And basically what they do is over the course of the day, they actually have volunteers that do a bear patrol. So they drive all the roads around town to basically, make sure that the polar bears aren't hanging around in town. They get into trouble, they go after trash, they do those, kind of get into dumpsters. So they did the people of Churchill do a really, really good job to make sure that not only the people that live there, but the visitors are staying very safe. So they're always patrolling the streets to make sure there aren't bears floating around town. But that patrol stops at 10 p.m. each night. So that's why they have that siren to let you know, hey, we're done for the night, you're on your own, and we don't advise you to go out after that. So you can see why, it's pretty quiet. Like I said, it was only about 11 o'clock at night, but it is pretty quiet out there, and a lot of lights for that exact reason as well, so that you can see if there's a bear coming down the street, to try to avoid, bears hiding out in shadows and that kind of thing. So a visit to Churchill, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. How you get up there is the first option is you take a flight from Denver and you fly into Winnipeg. And that's from Denver, that's 2 flights. There's a couple of different, Toronto was one, I think Seattle was another, and Los Angeles, I know, has flights directly to Winnipeg. So from Denver, you have to take 2 flights into Winnipeg. And then you stay overnight in Winnipeg, and then the next morning you fly out to Churchill. So it is 3 flights to get from Denver to Churchill. And the second option is to fly to Winnipeg. Again, take 2 flights, stay overnight in Winnipeg, and take a train. Now the train, I've actually never done this, and I keep saying I'm going to do it one of these years. I think it would actually be a really cool way to get to Churchill, but it does add, it's a 2-day trip, so it adds quite a bit of time onto your trip. It's a little bit less expensive than the flights as well. And then you'll have to do it all the way. You have to do it all over again on the way back. So when you're in the airport, the airport's very, very clean. This is the Winnipeg airport. Tim Hortons is kind of the equivalent of Starbucks in Canada, if you're not familiar with that. There are all these, I thought these were kind of creative with COVID. The length of a polar bear is approximately 6 feet. So they were using the width of a polar bear to tell people how far to stay apart from each other. So I thought that was creative. This was the other thing we were talking about, is what the requirements were to get into Canada. So this was as of November 2021. I don't know at this point what the trip this year will look like. I would suspect, unless something crazy happens, that it's going to be either this or a little bit more relaxed. So we needed to get a negative PCR test within 72 hours of the flight departing the US. I actually went out and took 4 tests within a 2-day window, because there was some confusion as to whether it was 72 hours from the time you left your airport so in my example, it would be Denver, or was it 72 hours of arriving in Canada, or was it 72 hours of arriving in Churchill? And I called a couple of places in Canada, and there was no consistency on the answer. So our whole group, most of the people in my group took 3 tests. I actually wound up taking 4. I'm glad I did, because actually the very first test I took was the last one I got the results of. And I got those results on my way to the Denver airport as I was leaving for Churchill. So that's always a fun little thing to do. My nose was a little raw by the end of those 2 days. A COVID vaccination card showing vaccines at least 2 weeks prior. And if you haven't had all of your vaccinations within 2 weeks, you can show them a negative COVID test within that 2-week window. There's a completion of an Arrive Canada survey on the Arrive Canada app, and it basically asks questions like, if you test positive for COVID when you're in Canada, what's your plan? Where are you going to stay? Will you be able to quarantine yourself away from other people? So just kind of general questions like that. And then on the way back, you had to have another negative COVID test within 24 hours of flying back to the US. And that was something that we were able to do right at the Churchill airport. We took the test before we got on our flight from Churchill to Winnipeg, and by the time we landed in Winnipeg, all of us had our results. So it was super, super smooth. They were right on top of that to take care of that for us. You needed your vaccination card to enter. Canada is actually really, I mean, in my opinion, was that I thought Canada did a really, really, really good job about this. You did need to have a vaccination card to enter restaurants, stores, and other established businesses within Churchill. They asked you for when you entered the front door. If you didn't have it, they politely asked you to leave. Most people seem to. We never saw any issues with it. So what I always told people was, keep the documents on your phone, take either a photograph, that's what this image is. This is my vaccination card. And I just took a photograph of it and kept it on my phone. Colorado actually has a really good system through the Department of Health, where you can actually download your card as well into a PDF. So you can keep it, like I have an iPhone, you can keep that right within the files on your phone. And then you also want to have a photograph or a photocopy of your passport too. And you want to make sure that your passport doesn't expire within 6 months of your trip. If it does, they will not allow you to use it, because the potential of not being able to get back into the US is a challenge at that point. And then simple things like money, Canadian money is a little bit different. You can use US money in Churchill, but you'll get Canadian money as change. So that's something that you would then have to exchange, either spend it before you leave Canada, or you'd have to get it exchanged back into US money down here. So every time you exchange the money, you lose a little bit of the value. So I wouldn't advise on doing that. This last trip, I actually wound up only taking out, I did not exchange any money, any US money into Canadian money. The only thing I did was I went to an ATM once to get money for cash for the tip for our guides. Otherwise, I just used my ATM card, and that worked out fine. And that's actually usually that's a really good exchange rate. So I would advise not to do it at the airport. That's usually the most expensive rate. And there is one bank in town in Churchill where there's a ATM there, or you can convert money as well. So this is the plane that we come in on. This is the only airline that flies in and out of Churchill. It's called Calm Air. Super, super great airline. Everybody's super friendly on there, very clean, very efficient. But it is the only airline that flies in and out. So it tends to be a little bit on the pricey side. My trip actually has this flight included in the total price. So the group that I use up out of Churchill actually gets a package deal on discounted flights. So we actually can save some money by doing it that way. But this is the plane that we fly on. Not super big. I would say it holds probably about 30, 36 people on it. It does land on the tarmac, so you have to walk out. There is not a jetway that goes right into the building. So you do need to be prepared when you get on the plane to have, warm jacket, boots. You can see that it was a little bit icy when we landed. So that's always something to kind of consider. So you want to make sure that you're ready to you're dressed for the cold. It was about a 2-hour flight out of Winnipeg to Churchill. So there's plenty of space on the plane to take off jackets, but then you want to make sure you have that with you. Once you arrive in Churchill, this is the sign that greets you. It's telling you never go beyond a polar bear alert warning sign. So right off the bat, they are making sure that you are well aware that you are in polar bear country. And as I mentioned, I was telling you that there's a lot of the prairie pothole type landscape. So this is a photo from the window that I was sitting next to on the flight into Churchill, and you can see how flat it is. We were actually really surprised. So these are all little lakes. You can see how much water is out there and how flat it is, but these are all lakes that are frozen. But there was no snow. The day that we flew in, we were actually really concerned that we weren't seeing snow on the ground when we flew in. They had only in Churchill received snow for the first time that season the day before we got there. That's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, is that the season is starting later and later because of climate change. So that's something to think about when you're timing your trip, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So now that you've arrived in Churchill, these are some of the things that you're going to start to expect to see. Obviously, most people go up there to see polar bears, but there's also quite a bit of other wildlife in the area that's unique to that area. Red fox are not unique to that area, but there are a lot of red fox. Arctic fox, snowshoe hares, Arctic hares, which are huge. They are absolutely huge, huge rabbits. Willow ptarmigan, which is what this bird is in the upper right-hand corner. Snowy owls, we did see several on this trip. We saw one gyrfalcon on this past trip. We saw quite a few snow buntings. I can't ever get anybody to convince to stop to photograph snow buntings. And we saw some common eiders. They're actually going through. So a lot of these animals, I mean, other than the ones that don't migrate, like the ptarmigan don't migrate, the Arctic hares, the snowshoe hares, and the fox do not migrate, but the gyrfalcons, the buntings, the eiders, they're kind of all doing the same thing. They follow the water down as it freezes. So there's still a good potential of not only seeing polar bears, but seeing some of these other animals as well. There are moose and wolves in the area, but they're more out into the forested area and a little bit more inland, and we don't My groups usually don't go out into those regions. So this was actually what happened on the first day of the last trip that I was there in November of last year. These are the vehicles. So the trip that I take, we actually go out in SUVs. It makes it much more convenient. It's a lot less damaging to the landscape than the Tundra buggies. But these are, they allow 3 photographers in each vehicle, so everybody gets their own window, and it just gives us a lot more mobility to really kind of access all the dirt roads in the area. There's actually only about 36 miles, I think it's about 35, 36 miles of dirt roads. But you can see that this one particular road actually went right along Hudson Bay. You can see that the water is not frozen. It was, there was no sign of it freezing when we first arrived. But this was one polar bear it was actually the first polar bear we saw last year. Pretty curious about what we were doing. And you can see I get this question quite a bit about how close do you get to the polar bears, and you can see how close this bear, he was only within, once he walked in front of this front forerunner, he was only a few feet from that front bumper. So it's a pretty special special experience to be that close to such a massive apex predator. Polar bears are super curious. That's the one thing I've really noticed about them. They have no fear of anything. They know they're an apex predator, and they're very curious. And that's actually what this bear is doing. You know, not only is he kind of sniffing, you know, picking up different scents on the ground, but they actually kind of do that around people. They kind of sniff the ground, and you'll see their eyes kind of looking sideways and watching things. And it's just kind of their casual way of kind of seeing what's going on around them. This was a mother and her second season cub. They were out on the other side of a hill sleeping one afternoon. So these are some of the photos that you might expect to see. We do not see very young cubs. If you've ever seen those photographs of the real tiny little cubs in the, you know, coming out of the den, that's actually happening this time of year from January to like early March. It happens in Wapusk National or Provincial Park, which isn't far from Churchill, but it is a very separate time of year. We rarely ever see small cubs. We usually see second season cubs, and that's a safety factor that the mama bears don't want to bring the little cubs, because there's a lot of male bears in the vicinity waiting for the ice to freeze, for the water to freeze as well. And the male bears will kill off cubs that are not their own. So very often what we'll see is our second season cubs. This is a polar bear, a young polar bear that's just been, it's out on its own for the first time. We saw her a couple of different times. Again, very curious. She just kind of wandered around, but this was out on the beach at low tide, and she was scavenging for food out on the beach. Again, this is that look that, hey, I know you're there, and I'm going to pretend that you're not really bothering me, but I'm going to keep my eye on you. This is a full frame. This is pretty close to full frame photo of a bear that's kind of strolling down the road. And this is why you want to time your trip, so that I was keeping an eye on photographs just before we arrived in Churchill, and the landscape was still very brown. You can see that the polar bear's legs are still really dirty, because it hadn't snowed that much. The snow helps to clean off the fur. So if you want whiter coats, you know, you want to make sure that you want to have that snow on the ground, so it cleans up the polar bear's fur. The other thing is that, you know, without the snow, this becomes a brown landscape, whereas this fresh snowfall really makes a much prettier landscape of having that cream polar bear coat on that white roads and white landscape, you know, white forest. It just makes it for, you know, in some ways a nicer image. Now, if you want to tell the other half of that, is that there's a story to be told that polar bears are struggling with climate change, and that's part of the story, that, you know, the snow is arriving a lot later, and, you know, they're staying dirtier longer and those kinds of things. Polar bears spend a lot of time, because they're waiting for the water to freeze, they just kind of spend a lot of time killing time. So one of the things that they'll do is they'll actually spend a lot of they'll spar with each other. It's usually 2 male bears. This actually happened to be a female bear and a male bear that were sparring with each other. And we were thinking they may actually be siblings. There's really no way to know that, but we were thinking they probably knew each other, and that was why they were spending a lot of time together. But we watched them for 2 days straight sparring with each other. They gave us quite a few good photo opportunities. Polar bears are, like I said, are real curious. They'll sniff anything. So if we're out in a group and we see something that's man-made, we'll usually try to position ourselves by those types of objects, because a lot of times the bears will come up on them. The bears will use these poles and signs for scratching posts. So there's scents from other bears on them. And this bear actually wound up standing on top of this. So we got some fun shots of that happening. This is an electrical line that actually has plastic covering on it because the polar bears play with them so much. I thought it looked like he was almost playing the cello or, you know, a bass. And so same thing, you know, played with that for, I don't know, probably about 45 minutes, kind of chewing on it and pulling on it. And surprisingly, it did not ever break, but it made for some fun photos. Portraits are definitely something you want to always try to get. As you saw in that that earlier image, the bears do get close enough so that you can do some really nice framing for portraits. You know, showing a little bit of the landscape, showing that it's snowing, showing that, you know, they're sitting in the willows. They do a lot of sleeping. That's part of the reason why you really don't want to wander off. It's amazing how well they can hide in these willows, even though they're only maybe 2 or 3 feet tall. They really can hide well in them when they're sleeping and bedded down. But these are nice photos to kind of show what the landscape's doing, what the weather's doing. This is what happens when, so there's stages of ice formation. The first stage is called grease ice, which is kind of this slick, it actually looks like it's like an oil slick on top of the water. It gets this, it's almost like a slushy, and it gets really thick, but it doesn't gel up, it doesn't freeze right away. And part of that's because of the salt water in it, but it creates this what's called grease ice, and it's just this kind of soupy surface ice, kind of like a slushy on top of it. And then what starts to happen is that the ice starts creating chunks. As I said, as that wind forces the water into the fresh water and it creates the ice, it actually starts creating chunks, but it's not quite strong enough yet for polar bears to go out on. So that's why this polar bear was just kind of resting on it. And this tends to happen pretty close to the shore, and then it'll eventually expand out into the bay. This is something you may have heard. The tundra buggies have been pretty popular over the years up there. These are pretty big vehicles. You can see, you know, like this door would probably be about a 7-foot tall door, just to give you an idea of just how tall these vehicles are. They still use these up there. There are some tour companies that still use them. There has been, you know, you can look at it from both ways. The access, these tundra buggies are limited to specific roads. They don't have the flexibility of the vehicles that we do. The flip side to it is that tundra buggies do have special roads designated for them that the vehicles can't go on. So there's a trade-off there. These are heated inside, and they have a platform on the backside where you can photograph out of the back, but you're always going to be photographing down on polar bears. You're never at ground level with these vehicles. If you're familiar with, over the years, there was National Geographic did I think it was either a show or a story about the guy that owned he had a whole, I don't want to call it a farm, but he had a whole property that had a lot of Siberian Huskies out on it. And you could see photographs of the Siberian Huskies and the polar bears together. And basically, so because he was feeding the Huskies, the polar bears would come in and eat the food, and the Huskies never really fought them for it. So they actually, there were some interesting photos over the years that came out of, you know, the symbiotic relationship of the Huskies and the polar bears in this property. Well, he died a few years ago. This is an older photo, and this was one of the puppies that they had. They always had the puppies out at the store in town that they owned, and the puppies were absolutely adorable. But unfortunately, he did pass away a few years ago, and his wife has not continued with the dog. So if you have seen photographs of that, that is one thing to that is not an option anymore to go out and see. But I did want to kind of bring that up. But they are absolutely adorable. So some of the other mammals that I mentioned before, Arctic fox, are just unbelievable to see up there. You get this white fox because they're already in their winter coat by the time that it's polar bear season, and then you get them out in this white landscape. These are all, I'm drawing a blank on the name of these rocks, but this is like old, it's almost like volcanic rock that's out, it's all along the coast of Hudson Bay. And it's this really interesting, you know, this black and white, these different shapes that are in it. And then you have to look really closely for fox that, you know, a lot of times they'll bed down in there. This past year, we did not see any fox. The fox populations have actually been dwindling. Again, another sign of climate change. The red fox is a more aggressive and larger fox than the Arctic fox. So as a result, the red fox is actually taking over more of this habitat. Arctic fox are losing the habitat to the red fox. The other thing is that the Arctic fox usually show up a little bit later than the polar bears, because the Arctic fox actually follow the polar bears out into the ice and eat the scraps that the bears leave behind. So because the ice is forming later and later, the Arctic fox are actually showing up a little bit later as well. There's another photo of an Arctic fox from a previous trip up there. A red fox out in that conglomerate rock out along the edge of Hudson Bay.
Hey, Dawn.
These were the eider. Yes.
This is Ellen. We have a question about polar bear eyesight. Can you touch on that for a minute?
Is a polar bear's eyesight decent? I don't know about their eyesight. I know their sense of smell is what drives them. They can smell up to several miles, which is why they can go out in the ice and actually find seals. And kind of like in a pinpoint direction, they can actually get right in to where they need to be because of their sense of smell. It's not their eyesight that's really strong for them. And that's kind of similar to other bears. Brown bears and polar and black bears are the same way. It's a sense of smell that's really strong for them. So these are, and I can look that up actually after we finish this. I can email that over to Ellen and she can get that out to you. So eyesight. So these were the eiders that we saw, in a non-breeding plumage. So that was kind of different. Even for me, this was a new bird. So for everybody in our group, I think that this was a new one. Like I mentioned, a lot of times people aren't too excited about the different birds. The willow ptarmigan, on the other hand, though, is again another animal that's a white on white and just makes for really, really interesting photos. This was photographed out at a place called the Northern Studies Research Center, which is all the way out on the end of the main road. It's a scientific study facility that basically it's kind of like they have a laboratory there, they have dorm rooms there, they have a cafeteria, they have a shop, like a gift shop, and they have bathrooms. That's the important part. So that's usually what we wind up doing. We spend the day, we drive all the way out there, use the restrooms, and then we leave. And as we were leaving on one day, we actually had just started to snow, and it was these big thick flakes. And just as we're leaving, so this is actually a spruce forest behind it. That's what's creating the darker background. These ptarmigan came up this ridge, and a bunch of us just kneeled down into the snow, and we're getting these really cool low angle photographs of the ptarmigan. A lot of times you'll see the ptarmigan actually in the willows, so the backgrounds can be a little bit busy, and this was just a really, really pretty scene. So I'm always looking for ptarmigan while we're out there. So just something a little bit different than polar bears, and kind of to fill the time in between polar bear sightings. This was one of the snowy owls that we saw, which was out on right along the water of Hudson Bay. That's usually where you'll see the snowy owls and the gyrfalcons. And then some of the other things, I always encourage everybody to make sure you don't focus on just the polar bears. When you get up there, it's taken a lot of time, it's taken a lot of money to actually visit Churchill. So capture some of the other things too that really kind of bring your trip together, tell that story of what that visit was like. So things like the Canadian flag. This was sunset on the first night up there. I'll be honest, we don't see a lot of nice sunsets up there. And all of us were like, man, if we could just have a polar bear walking through the scene, it would just be absolutely killer. But it was a gorgeous sunset. It was actually the first night we were there. The days are shorter. This was probably about 4:15 in the afternoon. And we go out about 7:30 in the morning. So they're not super long days because it's a little bit later in the year. But it was this just amazing sunset. Each trip, I usually have one good night, good sunset. I can't guarantee that, but kind of like those northern lights that we were talking about. But every once in a while we do have a nice sunset, but most of the time it's pretty cloudy and with some snow falling. It's not always windy. That's not a huge thing up there. So this is what we were talking about earlier. This is what has been termed the polar bear jail. You can see the sign on it. It's actually the official name of it is the Polar Bear Holding Facility. So what this is it's actually an old quinut. from World War II. So Churchill actually was a base for the Canadian military during World War II. So that's why there's so much structure up there. That's why there's an airport there. They were using it as a place to kind of protect and to launch, to have, you know, boats and planes leave out of there during World War II. But a lot of that infrastructure still remains behind. So they've converted this building into what they call the polar bear jail. So what winds up happening is that the bears that I mentioned actually come into town or get a little bit too close to town and don't quite get the message that they're not supposed to be there. They actually, they will actually, I hate to use the term collect, but they'll dart the bears and they actually bring them into this facility and they'll hold them there until the ice forms. And then once the ice forms, they bring them back out and they actually take them out to the ice. And it's basically meant to be a sort of therapy to teach them that being in town is a bad thing because this is what's going to happen to you. And that's why the concept or the term jail has come up, that, you know, just like people, the bears don't want to be in this jail or in this, you know, isolated in this facility for any length of time. So it seems to be working pretty well. They've had it in place for quite a few years. And the image on here, this was actually new. I think this was done in 2017. One of the guides that I work with up there, this is actually a painting based on his photograph. So if you ever go up there for Northern Lights as well, this is something that's used a lot of times in the foreground for Northern Lights in the evening. So this is that grease ice that I was talking about. You can see this kind of sludgy right above the grasses here. That's that kind of, it's like a thick, you know, soupy water kind of. But this is actually just looking out into Hudson Bay. This was a bit of a windy day with some, you know, a little bit of rain coming down, or like a little mist that was causing it to just freeze right onto the grasses. But again, I'm always, you know, reminding people, you know, make sure you're catching photographs of everything while you're up there. You know, catch the landscape, catch the different buildings, catch the you know, the different property, the signs. You know, the signs are unique. You know, there's many places you won't see signs with polar bears on them. This is an old shipping vessel that was actually owned by Aristotle Onassis, Jackie Kennedy's second husband. But it actually it went aground in the 60s and it slowly has been rusting away. There's actually a hole that goes all the way through the bottom of it now. But this is out, so you can go out on out in these rocks and take photographs of that. Again, if you go up for Northern Lights up in Churchill, this is something, all of this water freezes. So you can actually go out to this boat, like this time of year, you can walk out to the boat and you can actually use that as a foreground subject as well. This is another picture. Actually, I happened to catch a rainbow. That was a first for me up there. But again, you can see this is all grease ice. So that's what this is looking like. It's not frozen, but it's just thicker. So again, you know, other things, this was one of the, you know, when we stopped to get hot chocolate and warm up a little bit and use a restroom, this was one of the restaurants that we stopped in, but I photographed one of the wall hangings of a polar bear hide. There was in 2017, the same year that the polar bear jail was painted, there was a whole art process or art exhibit that was done around Churchill. One artist out of, I think she was out of Winnipeg, came up and painted a whole bunch of murals on different walls. So there's a lot of really unique just artwork on these abandoned buildings or these, you know, kind of dilapidated buildings. So this is just one of those. This is another one. These are old satellite, I don't want to call them dishes, but I don't know the correct term, but, you know, old satellite receivers maybe from World War II. So, and then they painted the bottom half of the building during that 2017 project. This is one of the Canadian provincial guards, similar to our park rangers, who was very happy to pose for us. He said that he does it 1,000 times a day and he enjoys it, but he's actually patrolling. This would be, if Churchill sits on the southwest corner of Hudson Bay, this is kind of on the northern end of town, or the northwest end of town. And he actually patrols this area, kind of making sure that there aren't polar bears kind of lingering around on the rocks or anything. So that's basically what he does all day, is he kind of walks up and down the rocks and talks to people and smiles for photographs. So timing for a polar bear trip. This is the tricky part. Based on the freeze up, you want to get out there before the ice freezes, because once the water freezes, the bears are gone. They don't hang around town. But you don't want to get there too early, because as I was mentioning earlier, you don't want to have a brown landscape. You want to have some of that snow. So it's usually about a 3 to 4 week window is the ideal time. The average date used to be around November 7th for the water to freeze. So you would go the end of October, early November. Climate change is pushing this date back and making it a little bit more unpredictable. The grease ice started to form in last year on November 11th, which was during our trip. The water actually froze on December 1st last year, and that was because of one storm that came in. They were actually expecting it to not freeze until about the 3rd week of December last year. So because of that one storm, it froze. So that kind of gives you an idea of the timing of these things. Most people start to go in late October through mid-November. Late November, they'll still have trips, but you run a little bit more of a risk of not having as many polar bears around. So as I mentioned, you want to be there before the water freezes, but when the ground is covered with snow. And the first snow was November 6th, the day before we got there last year. So the travel experience. So these are some of these signs. There's a phone number you can call that if you do see a bear, you can. So these are tacked all over town, so that you just have to use your cell phone to give them a call and let them know. It is a very remote, making it expensive, and it is no frills location, because everything that they have in town, they have to ship up there, because there are no roads. It makes it very difficult to get supplies in and out of town. But the locals are super, super friendly. Everybody's very helpful. They're very accommodating. The restaurants are actually pretty good, considering that it is a remote location. And what I actually recommend for my group is that we go out to dinner every night. And what I have for the trip this year is that our breakfast and our dinners are included, and then lunch is on your own while we're out in the field. So we don't come back into town to eat lunch unless we're just not seeing anything, or if it's super, super cold and we really need to come back into town to allow people to warm back up. So what I do is the first night that we're there, I take the whole group over to the grocery store, and we buy some supplies, things that you can make sandwiches with, like peanut butter and jelly and bread, or you buy things that you can, snacks that you can take with you out to the field that you don't have to heat up. So those kinds of things. And then that seems to work really, really well. And we wind up sharing everything in the vehicles over the course of the day. You want to bring at least 2 camera bodies with you, in case something happens to one. Cell phones with video capability are a great addition too, because the cell phones do such a great job with video these days. And I think it's kind of cool to take videos, take videos of the ice forming, take videos of polar bears coming around, take videos of the group, doing different things. Like this was that sunset that I showed you from last year. This was the first night that we were there, and this guy was taking, he was just using a cell phone so that he could just quickly send it off to his family back at home. Camera bodies and gear should be weather resistant, because as I mentioned earlier, we will run into snow and possibly wind while we're up there. The longest lens you can afford is what you want to bring. I do bring a 500, and rent a long ones if you don't own one. That's always a great option. 150 to 600 millimeter lens will work perfectly. It's it's less expensive, it's less weight, and it still has that reach for you. Of my 10,000 plus photos from Churchill over the years, about 7,200 were taken with my 500 millimeter lens, and another 1,000 were with a 70 to 300 or a 150 to 600. I do bring a wide angle lens. I have a 24 to 70 that I bring with me as well, but I don't, I used it for the night photograph. That becomes more of my documentary lens. That I take photographs of the rooms and take photographs of the hotel where we stay. Other gear, make sure you bring lots of memory cards. There is not any place in town to buy memory cards, so you want to make sure that you have all that you need with you. And I recommend a budget of 1,000 files a day. And I know that sounds crazy, but when you're in a place like Churchill and it's the first time you've been someplace that remote, or you think you might not make it back again for whatever reason, or you never know. You just take photographs of everything, so you can always delete them later. So that's my recommendation, is to budget about 1,000 photos a day. The weight limit for carry-on luggage on the plane on that Calm Air flight to Churchill is 20 pounds. And for us photographers, that's extremely difficult to get our camera gear into under that weight. So what I've actually recommended to people is you have a checked bag, which would have all of your clothing, all of your warm weather gear, maybe your tripod, and then you can actually have, so you can bring a 20 pound or less carry-on bag. So that actually could hold a computer if you had a little laptop bag or a purse, or like a little duffel bag that maybe just has some things to use on the flight, and some general maybe an extra hat or something like that. There's also the option of valet. And this allows you to, it's basically, it still goes on the plane, it still goes in the holding bay underneath, but it doesn't go through the conveyor belt. So you actually, when you walk out into the tarmac, you hand it to a valet attendant who will actually take the bag. And then when you land in Churchill, they will actually bring that out. They don't put it on the conveyor belt, they bring it out on the little cart and they hand that back to you. So that's actually the best option for your camera gear. Make sure you bring lots of batteries. The cold will drain your batteries quick, and make sure you have the chargers for those as well. The best thing to do with batteries is to keep them inside of a jacket, or someplace where you can actually help keep them warm with your own body heat. Bring waterproof covers for your cameras and lenses, and bring a plastic. This is something I recommended. I mentioned it earlier when you guys were talking about the butterfly pavilion. Bring a plastic bag large enough to cover your gear to transfer in and out of cold. The humidity up there is going to, if you have your camera gear inside a hotel and it gets really warm overnight and you go back out into the cold, the first thing that's going to happen with it is that the lens is going to just basically fog up. And it'll take about 30 minutes for that to actually equalize back into the temperature outside. And potentially you could have the same thing happen when you come back in at night, which isn't good for having that moisture on your camera. So I suggest bring a plastic bag, and what you can do is, as you're coming in and out, you put that over your gear, and that actually helps keep some of that the room temperature or the outdoor temperature around your camera, and lets it kind of equalize a little bit faster. Oops. You want to make sure you have a tripod with spikes at the end of the leg, so that helps stabilize it and make it kind of lock it in when it's standing, so it doesn't slide around. Definitely bring your chargers and power cords. Bring some cleaning supplies. The cloths are really helpful in the cold temperatures. I usually have extra ones with me just to make sure that I don't want to see anybody having any issue with snow on their glass. I do recommend bringing yak tracks or other traction device for your feet. It's a little bit, when you're in the vehicle, you have to kind of be careful, but it will help when you're standing out on the road to just give you a little extra traction on the ground. And then a backpack for your gear, some sort of small bag. And this is the bag that I use for my 20 pound carry-on. This is a photo of me with my gear out in the field. You can see that, I've got a big heavy jacket on with a hood, hat, gloves. I recommend using a liner with what is a hunter's glove that has a flip top on it, like a thick fleece hunter's glove with a flip top. And I actually put hand warmers in between those two gloves. You can also put hand warmers in your pockets, so that when we're standing around waiting for polar bears or other animals to do something, you can actually put your hands in the pockets to kind of help keep them warm. I don't recommend, I don't use the full foot warmers. I find they just bunch up in your feet, and then you get really uncomfortable, and you do not want to take your shoes off when you're out in the field, because it'll be very hard for them to warm back up once you put the boots back on. Toe warmers, however, can be helpful. I still don't use them a lot, but I know people that do like to use toe warmers. But this is a backpack that I have from, it's actually a Mind Shift backpack. And what's nice about it is that it's a sling, so it actually just swings around. It has a water bottle holder. It allows me to hold one additional lens, one additional body, camera cards, cleaners, just the essentials of what I need when I'm out in the field. Maybe a little, some little snacks. And that just works really well for when I'm out there. These are some other things that somebody asked, how cold is it? When we were there, it was in the 20s, between the 20, I would say 20 25 degrees to about 35 degrees. It doesn't vary very much each day. You know, unlike here in Colorado, we can see 40-degree temperature swings. In Churchill, it's a much more consistent temperature, but it hovered right around freezing, a little bit lower than freezing. The days that temperature isn't super bad. What tends to get really tough is when the wind kicks up. And that's where you want to make sure you have really good clothing that keeps your, that breaks that has a wind barrier, you know, is windproof for you. Clothing, you know, you want to have footwear that keeps your feet warm. These boots actually are called mucklucks. These up at the upper right. I'm actually thinking about getting a pair of them. I know a few people that use them for, you know, like photographing in Yellowstone or any place where they might be standing on snow for a while. They're actually made a US company out of Minnetonka, Minnesota that makes them. And everybody I know raves about them. They actually say they're super warm. They actually have a pretty decent grip on the bottom of the sole. Plus, you know, they're a little bit more stylish. What I have used is muck boots. These are the Arctic version of the muck boots, and these work really well too. Great grippy sole on the bottom, nice thick sole inside, so that your feet have, you know, a lot of separation between the ground and the bottom of your foot to help keep your foot warm. Waterproof outer layer. I've put this photo of this photographer in here because I noticed on this past trip, several people had hoods with faux fur along the hood. And what it actually did is it actually blocked, on those windy days, it actually blocked the snow from reaching your face. It can be a little bit of, you know, it reduces your peripheral vision, but from a perspective of snow blowing, it actually made quite a difference for several people. So that was something that I was actually noticing. It's probably something else that I'll get from the next trip. You do want to make sure that your outer layer is waterproof, both your top and the bottom. The bottom pants that I actually have been really happy. I have a pair of, they are called, drawing a blank on the name. They're from Eddie Bauer, and they're actually fleece lined hiking pants, guide pants. That's what they're called. The pro guide, I think, is what Eddie Bauer calls them, but they're fleece lined, and they actually, the snow never sticks to them. So, and they're surprisingly warm. So that's the pants that I use. And you want to have warm socks that don't cut off circulation, because if you cut off circulation, your feet will get cold. Even though you think 2 pairs of socks might be good, if you cut circulation off, the blood flowing through your feet can't keep your foot warm. Make sure you have hand warmers, double layer gloves. I already mentioned that option that I do. Definitely bring a warm hat that covers your ears. I recommend at least having a couple in case it does snow and one gets wet. And then a face covering, something that can kind of keep, because you want to make sure that your skin's not exposed out in that cold weather, since we do tend to be out there quite a bit. This is the Buff multifunctional polar reversible headwear and face mask. So this is, again, a fleece lined Buff, if you're familiar with those neck scrunchies. This one happens to be polar lined. And I noticed on this last trip that that Northern Study Center that I mentioned, they actually sell them with their logo and a Northern Lights photograph on them. So if you want to support kind of the local businesses, you can pick one up while you're there. All right, let's see. There we go. Weather. So the calendar may say fall, but it is winter in Churchill by the end of October. You know, we think here in Colorado we have a long winter. They have a very long winter up there. Expect temperatures in the upper 20s to low 30s, and winds are very likely, making the damp air feel cooler. And you can see all of this, you know, so this is kind of late in the afternoon when we're photographing this bear, and you can see all the ice that kind of crystallized on all of the willows around the bear. So, I mean, it makes for a really pretty scene, but you just want to make sure you're prepared for it. You know, there's poor clothing, but there's not poor weather, there's poor clothing. So as long as you're prepared for it, you'll be fine. And then photographing snow can be a challenge. If there's falling snow, autofocus can be difficult to use for focusing on your subject. So there's a couple of different ways that you can overcome this. One is to do a manual focus. You can pre-focus on where you think the subject will be and then switch to manual to lock in that focus location. You can do a fast shutter and spray and pray, which I have certainly done on occasion, and just hoping that you can follow the animal. Or you can use on the Nikon, the Al Servo, and use a 3D setting. I'm sure Canon and Sony have similar settings where it's basically it's tracking. I would imagine on the mirrorless cameras, I haven't switched to mirrorless yet, hopefully this year, that the mirrorless cameras, a lot of them have eye tracking. So I would think that that would actually do a phenomenal job as well in helping in snowy situations. Somebody says, please explain spray and pray. Basically just taking a lot of photos and hoping that, so you're taking a lot of photos and you're praying that some of them are sharp. You know, as you're as the animal's moving around and you just keep taking more photographs. You want to make sure that you know, the best spot to photograph when it is snowing like that and you have a white on white animal is to find that contrast area. So like on a bear or a willow ptarmigan, that typically is the eye. You know, and the eye is always where we want to have the sharpest point in the photograph anyway, but that's where the most contrast is. And that'll help the camera actually pick up a point that it can focus and lock on. The other thing about photographing in a white landscape and a snowy landscape is that the auto exposure tries to get whites to 18% gray, and that can make your snow look very gray and dull and not very bright and white. So what you want to do is overexpose to allow more light in of at least 1 to 2 stops to make a brighter white. And you can also use the exposure compensation. That's another thing that'll help on setting your exposure compensation on your camera body to, you know, anywhere from 1 to 2 stops. So this is, you've probably seen, if you've seen one of my presentations before, this is one quote that I love sharing: the most compelling photographs you take begin with the things about which you're most passionate and most curious. Obviously, I love photographing bears, black bears, brown bears, polar bears. They're just so charismatic, and there's, you know, just the curiosity that they have is just so fun to photograph. So I would recommend signing up for my mailing list. I have a blog on my website that has some information about various trips and different tips and things. I do have workshops on my website, and I have this ebook's been updated to a 2nd edition. I do have a couple of others that I'm working on right now, probably 3 within the next 6 months that'll be coming out. So if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll get information about those. We talked about this earlier, that my brown bear photography trip for next year. I'm not doing one this year as I'm going to scout a couple of new locations, but next year we're going up to in September. So that actually should be during the salmon, that should still be during the salmon run. So that's the goal for that trip, is to catch some fishing bear shots. And that's in Lake Clark National Park in Alaska. And then the polar bear trip this year is the same week actually that I went last year. So it should be perfect timing again for catching the right environmental elements with the snow and water and polar bear action. So this is my contact information. Let's see if you guys have any other questions. I didn't see any other new ones come up.
Well,